Are you listening to Discovery Debrief? And so did I. It's Jason Isaacs, who was, at some point, some version of Captain Lorca. Right now, I'm just a fan.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Discovery Debrief, a podcast setting a course to discuss the future of the final frontier in Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, Lower Decks, and more. I'm co-host Chris Clow, and I'm joined by two additional members of our bold panel of Star Trek franchise explorers, including Rachael Clow.
Hey!
And Cicero Holmes.
My intro has been death-struck.
Excellent. So, for this episode, we're joined by a very special guest. He's a longtime comics historian, writer, and novelist who's created an abundance of captivating stories in some of our favorite shared universes, including Star Wars, Mass Effect, Halo, Planet of the Apes, the Marvel Comics universe, and, of course, the Star Trek universe. In fact, just about a month ago, this man's latest prose novel was released in the universe that has brought us all together in the form of Star Trek Discovery: The Enterprise War, showing us what Captain Pike, Lieutenant Spock, and Commander Una were all up to during the events of the Federation-Klingon War as depicted in Discovery's first season. So, here to discuss that book and Star Trek at large with us is none other than author John Jackson Miller. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Oh, excellent. Well, we're really happy to have you. So, first thing that I like to ask anybody that jumps in with us, and before we go into talking specifically about the book, I noticed that you got your start writing as an editor for trade magazines dedicated to the comics and tabletop gaming industries, but it looks like your biggest proverbial footprint is in the galaxy far, far away. You've written in both comics and prose across both the previous Legends EU continuity and now the official post-Disney Star Wars canon, and your contributions to Star Trek seem comparatively recent compared to most of your previous work. So if you don't mind, share with us your Star Trek story. How deep does your fandom go? And in terms of creating the stories, what helps to separate the Star Trek toy box from some of the others that you played in?
Well, I was born the night that A Piece of the Action aired for the first time, so I showed up the same time that Fizz-Ben did, the card game. But it'd be a number of years before I actually, would see it. Of course, I was not in vitro, watching the original series. Although that would have been interesting and a plot for a story sometime, I would imagine. My first exposure to Star Trek would have been just the reruns on TV, syndicated, and of course I was also seeing the cartoons on NBC as they were originally aired. But it was something that always seemed to be kind of aimed a little bit over my head at that age. Being in the single digits, I was 9 years old when Star Wars showed up, and so that dominated my fandom up through as those movies are coming out. I begin to pick up a bit more Star Trek here and there, and particularly once we get cable TV, we've got Wrath of Khan, which is appearing every 13 minutes on HBO, and so I'm able to absorb that, and by that point, I'm able to get into some of the comics, and I've gotten some of the novels, some of the, I think the first novel I got, I would have seen the log books in my middle school library, but I would not probably buy a book until the Klingon Gambit, which I think is the third of the, when they were doing the numbered pocket books editions. So we're talking about early 80s there. And then when Star Wars goes away, more or less, after Return of the Jedi and sort of goes into hibernation, or perfect cryogenic frozen sleep, if you want to say that, it is it's Star Trek that begins to take more of my time and interest, particularly as we get Search for Spock and Voyage Home come out, and then finally Next Gen. That gives me a chance to get on the ground floor of a TV series and watch it as people did in the 60s as it's coming out. And
Sure.
I'm into it to an extent. It doesn't really catch fire for me until that sort of moment where it kind of does for everybody. And everything that's sort of downrange after yesterday's Enterprise, where we start to get Riker grows the beard, we get the Borg, we get the best of both worlds, and probably most significantly for me, we get into the Klingon arcs that are really developing Kronos and that lead to much of what I would do in the Prey trilogy a number of years later. Pretty much by the time Star Wars comes back around, I've probably spent more time with Star Trek over those years than Star Wars stuff.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so you mentioned that it caught fire for you at the height of, or as Next Generation was really kind of on the upswing. So did you watch all the other shows as they were coming out as well?
I did. It gets complicated to an extent. It gets complicated as time goes on because, I got a job with, you mentioned trade magazines. I was the editor of Comics Retailer, which later became Comics and Games Retailer, in 1993. And so, I was working nights and weekends, and certainly I'm keeping up with stuff as I can. But by the time we get to say Enterprise, I realized I missed the entire third season because I was at that point I was at that point I had a new child. I had my second by that point. And I was also, in addition to the regular job, working on the magazines, which at that point included also Comics Buyer's Guide, the newspaper, and also Scry, the card game magazine. I was also freelancing for Marvel Comics at that point. And Iron Man was coming out every 2 weeks for the spring of 2004. So I didn't see any TV at all. And, I recently joked, I have no idea whether there was a Super Bowl that year. I was absolutely locked away. And, now it's easier to, kind of pick stuff back up. Although, as in the case of Enterprise, I still have yet to actually pick up the entire series again from the start.
Mm-hmm. I think that's understandable considering the different directions that you're stretching yourself into. Well, so what is it, or what do you think rather about Discovery as a series so far? And what's your take on how it's positioning itself for a massive time jump for season 3? Because I imagine that stuff kind of has to start entering your mind, especially if you plan on potentially contributing to the franchise in the future.
Well, the thing about Discovery is, when it's set, we're about, we're a decade before Kirk. And it kind of juggles the rules a bit. One of the things that I had to get used to as I, sort of made the transition from writing Star Wars to Star Trek. And actually, the part I skipped over here was that I actually pitched Star Trek before I pitched Star Wars. I wrote a story intended for Strange New Worlds back when that was going on, which was a close but no cigar kind of a thing. But then I had a Star Trek Starfleet Corps of Engineers story which was accepted, but then the series ended before the book could actually come out. I was pitching for Star Trek even before I started doing Star Wars. But then I have this period where there's about a decade there where I'm writing Star Wars. One of the things that I had to sort of reacclimate to, since I was writing in the next gen era, a lot of the dynamic in Star Wars is you've got characters that don't necessarily want to be together. They're thrown into a situation. They don't intend to be heroes. They bicker, they argue. Star Wars, the original movie, is nothing but one-liners from characters that are arguing with each other. And I could not bring that dynamic into Star Trek because that's one of those things with Roddenberry wanted is we've pretty much wiped out most of the bad workplace situations. People are not picking on each other all the time. They're not insulting each other. They're not doing any of that. Not in Starfleet anyway. With the aliens, they can do it all day long. But with Discovery, we're still getting to that point where you're able to have more interpersonal conflict earlier on, and by also having the Klingon War happen at the same time, that sort of doubly makes it a different feeling series than any of the other things that have come before. And so, we have that in Discovery. It catches fire for me once they go to the mirror universe. Of course, that's always a winner whenever you do that. And in this particular case, it was sort of interesting that we have this dark mirror of the Starfleet world of the Federation universe in a particular time where things are already fairly dark for the Prime universe. So you do get a situation where it's possible for somebody in the mirror universe to actually hide out and not be noticed if they want it to be. And again, when that happened as well, and I try not to get into spoilers on anything if I can help it. But when that happened as well, that was something where I went, I love that bit because I over in Star Wars in Knights of the Old Republic, I spent 3.5 years of a comic series with a traitor hidden in the cast, and the clues were there all along. And the series had to work. It was different in comics because we never knew when the series would get canceled. So everything I wrote had to work both ways. In case I never got to resolve that storyline, that character's behavior had to be explained by other things. And what we see with Discovery is they're taking advantage of the fact that they had their number of episodes, solidly determined beforehand, made them all at once. They can do something in terms of storytelling that you could not necessarily do with regular series television. We all remember. Well, I don't say we all remember. Everyone of a certain age that's in science fiction remembers Babylon 5, when J. Michael Straczynski gets to the point where it looks like he's not going to get a 5th season. And so he rushes all of the endings to wrap in season 4. And actually that tends to work because it just sort of speeds up the tempo. It makes it more frenetic. And that worked out. But with Star Trek Discovery, they don't have that to worry about. They don't have that concern of, will they pick this up after the back half of the season or whatever. They have a good idea that, they're going to be doing these additional stories, or that they're going to have 13 or 15 or however many episodes it is to tell their storyline. And so you can do something, pretty daring like that, hiding a traitor in the cast for that long. I think that's really cool.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I guess the big question in the room is, what is your favorite Trek television show? and favorite movie. I know that you mentioned a couple, but what is the definitive list for you?
I think Next Generation is special for me because it was the one that I got to see from the start and that I got to see while it was coming out, and where I did not have to, suffer the problems that, I cannot tell you for certain that I have seen every original series episode because the way it was presented to me, the way it was presented to all of us over the years is, these shows weren't serialized because they expected that the syndicators would show them in random order. And in fact, that's what they did a lot of the time. They would show them in random order. And, it's always cool. Every so often you'll see something that you haven't seen before. And, I'm a bit reluctant to stream the entire series just because I'll go through it all and that'll be the end. No more discoveries like that. But yeah, so, I mean, with Next Gen, that was one where it was coming out while I was in college and grad school. I was able to see it all and able to see particularly, probably the high water mark is reunification, where it actually is. You've got an episode coming out that is teasing something that's about to happen in Star Trek VI the next week. I thought that was just a really cool case of synergy. As for the movies, it's specific favorites. It gets dicey. Everybody has this thing about odds and evens. Until Insurrection came along, I was really big on the threes. So I loved 3 and I loved 6. And it's hard not to like, 2 and 4, obviously, but I like 3 and 6 a lot more than other people do. And so, when I did the Prey trilogy, obviously, the main character that we are dealing with in that is Krug and his heirs. Then of course, what do we have happen in the Prey trilogy? We have a Star Trek VI like political debacle disaster happen on Starfleet's watch, but instead of it being Kirk's problem, it's actually Picard's problem.
Well, you're speaking my language because 6 is my favorite of the movies, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, what is your least favorite episode of The Next Generation? Because I have a thing where I try to convince people that the worst episodes of The Next Generation are not that bad. So
okay. I could have done without Tasha Yar being killed by the oil slick. I was not real big on that.
That's hard to argue with.
I think that's pretty understandable.
Yeah.
Well, so I always like to ask people, especially that work on these properties, a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, because as someone who contributes and has contributed voluminously to the Star Wars canon that quote unquote counts everything, as opposed to the Star Trek universe that doesn't do that. Does that change your approach at all into the way that you actually write for Star Trek? Because I would think that might offer you slightly more latitude in terms of what you can do and characters you can use, but maybe not. Is there any comparison to the rigidity, I guess, of what you're allowed to do when comparing CBS with Lucasfilm?
A lot of it has to do with whether something is still in production. And so, okay, look, we're doing, the Prey trilogy, which is mostly set in 2386. So this was years after, Nemesis. The time I'm writing those books, there is nothing on the horizon. I don't think CBS All Access was even on yet. There was no, Discovery was not announced, that's for sure. And certainly there was no notion that there would ever be a Picard show. Cause, I think I took that contract in 2014. So we're talking a good ways back. And so when I said I want to, take over the universe for about 3 months of time in the timeline, that was something where I had a bit more freedom. Obviously, I couldn't do anything that, violated the spirit of the characters. And in fact, there was an early draft of Prey where the character of Ardra was depicted as having killed people with her illusions. They said, no, we can't do that because we never saw her do that in the TV show. And you want to stay true to that spirit, and that's what we did. And what we did instead ended up being better, I think. But a lot of it has to do with whether something is in production, whether something's in motion. I have a book coming out, I think in October it is, from Dynamite Comics. I did the 40th anniversary 40th anniversary comic series for Battlestar Galactica. And that was the original series Galactica. And, with Universal, it was pretty much like, go do what you want to do, because it was not the case. And this is a comic series that started last year at the 40th anniversary. So, the collection is going to be out, just in time for, what would have been Galactica 1980 to have come on 40 years in the past. But yeah, I mean, it was something where I was able to use everything I wanted to use. And not collide with anything else because there wasn't anything else out there. All of that said, I still try to not, collide with things if I can help it. Nobody pretends that the novels that came out from Pocket in the 80s and the 90s and the comics that came out from DC and the various others are necessarily, something that we have to worry about. And yet there are references in Enterprise War to cast members from, say, the Star Trek Early Voyages comics that came out from Marvel during the heartbeat and a half that it had the Star Trek license back in 1996-97. So, yeah, I mean, it's why do I do it? I do it for the same reason that people created the expanded universe in Star Wars to begin with. That wasn't something that came from Lucasfilm. It came because the authors were reading each other's works, and they were putting in Easter eggs. I mean, where did it all really begin? It begins with in Star Wars. It begins with Archie Goodwin, who's writing both the Marvel comic series and the comic strip in the newspaper, where he is writing an adaptation in the comic strip of Brian Daley's novel, Han Solo at Star's End. And so concepts from Han Solo at Star's End end up filtering into that comic strip. And it goes from there. And so, I think that's kind of fun stuff. I mean, it's something where it kind of came about organically. And again, with Star Wars also, when Timothy Zahn is starting to do the Heir to the Empire trilogy, what did they do? They just sent him the role-playing game that West End did, which had all this world building that was already done. And they said, why not? Just go ahead and use it. And so I find myself doing that all the time. I mean, there are bits in Enterprise War which are directly advised by Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise, by the Franz Joseph blueprints, some of the very old things that are out there. And whether they're official or whether they're correct or whether they're whatever, it's just fun. And it's better to draw on something than nothing.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I can totally agree with that. Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's fun to me. I can see how some writers might see that as an impediment, but these are very rich worlds. So I'm glad that you can see the fun in that. We've also spoken with a couple of other
nobody
writers.
Nobody constrains me to it, though. I mean, nobody forces me to do it that way. Yeah. So, I mean, I have also said that stories are more than just how they connect, or how they put together. So, yeah, I particularly, if it's a book like this, where I do know the stuff, I'm a lot more willing to put the connections in there, than say, I've done video game comics and short stories for Halo, where I can tell you right now, I don't have that universe cold. I don't know everything. I'm terrible at the game. So it's something where it is good that they make it so it's possible to write these books, without necessarily knowing everything. But when you can do it, it works out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, that's really interesting. I hadn't really ever thought of it in that kind of a perspective before. Oh, that's cool. Well, we have spoken with a couple of other writers of Discovery novels specifically. Dayton Ward, who wrote Drastic Measures, and Dave Gallanter, who's writing the Paul Stamets focused novel that's coming out in December. Both of them told us about some of the involvement of the show's writer's room to one degree or another. Dayton is friends with Kirsten Beyer, who's a prominent Trek writer, and Dave said he had access to season 2 scripts before the episodes aired. Can you share what your process was like in aligning the events of the Enterprise War with what had already aired and what was still to come as you were writing?
Well, Kirsten as well was where this process started. She let us know where would be a good place to, put a book. And, same way with the book that I'm working on currently, of which I can say nothing other than that it is a Discovery book.
Right.
But
Cool.
We announced that at Vegas. But we can say nothing other than that it's a Discovery book for 2020. But it's one of those things where, she suggested where would be a good place to put this book and kind of what, they wanted to see in it in terms of, we'd like to bring it from, let's get it from the Jeffrey Hunter version of Pike to the character that we're going to see played by Anson Mount. And let's also have a couple of things in here which directly plug into the TV series, such as, mentions of Spock's relationship with Burnham. And then, of course, we've got a more direct tie-in with, Spock actually having the incident happen that we later see on screen. As to what specifically I was supplied, I really, it's one of those things somebody says, why don't you just say more about what you get in advance? One of my problems is I'm working on several different franchises at a time that all have different rules in terms of what you can disclose about, as the CIA calls it, sources and methods. Right. So for example, last year I had two Disney movies that came out this year. I wrote original graphic novels for them. So that was Dumbo and The Lion King. And both of those, the lids were on really tight because Star Wars, Disney anything is a very tight ship, as far as that kind of stuff goes. So I don't say anything. And I've just gotten to where I just don't say anything about anything because I don't want to get confused and realize, oh yeah, wait a minute. This is that franchise. So I try not to get into too much detail, until it's many years after the fact. And the TV show's been out for a decade or the movie's been out for a decade or something like that. I will say that a lot of the stuff for Battlestar Galactica, I had to actually, do that research on my own and send the artist visual references to make sure that he didn't get the 2003 and 1978 versions of everything mixed up.
They're quite different.
Oh yeah. Well, so they're different to the eye of somebody who saw the original. Yeah.
Yes. Definitely. So, John, there was one thing, there were several things that happened, when I was reading the Enterprise War, that I found remarkable. But one thing that kind of sticks out to me is the fact that despite me knowing that the main protagonist, the crew of the Enterprise would survive, or at least the principal players that we knew, that they would survive, I still felt the drama. I still felt angst, when reading about the different things that were happening during the course of the book. So that is definitely, a success that you can hang your hat on. The question is, how do you do that?
Thank
you.
you.
How do you create that drama? How do you, how are you able to create the suspense, even though the reader, the assumption is that the reader knows the source material, the reader knows the end game for many of these characters. And so how do you create that suspense for them?
Well, this is one of those things, my mother just moved up to Wisconsin from where I grew up. And so I've been showing her all the TV shows she likes to see in movies and things. And, she is one of these people who always wants things spoiled for her. She wants to know that everybody's going to come out all right in the end. Sure. She wants to know the ending as we're going along. Do they get married? Does he get out of this? Whatever. And actually her favorite show is Perry Mason because every single episode except for one ends the same way. There's no drama. There's no crisis. It's all about just how you get there. And it's very comforting. It's comfort television, and I can dig that. But in something like this, yeah, you're right. We all know what happens to Pike. We all know what happens to Spock. We all know that the Enterprise, eventually gets out of whatever this thing is. Right. But what you don't know is how. Mm-hmm. And particularly, one of the things that you've got going on is, unless you can, I guess it works this way in an ebook, and it probably the only place it doesn't work quite like that is in the audiobook, where you're holding the book and you realize, oh my gosh, we're 4/5 of the way through this thing. How are they going to get out of this? And you're not so much concerned about how the characters get out, but how the author is going to get the characters out. Yes. Because obviously that's where the suspense is. And that's where the suspense is for me too, because I'm usually getting close to the end of my word count. And I'm like, how do I do this? But it is the case where, I a lot of the time, I will seek to write a final few scenes, for my resolution, where I'll try to wrap, relatively quickly. So we still have a good deal of drama going on, fairly late in the book. And then it's just a matter of, that's really craft at that point, because, if it ends up being, what was the old, the old joke in the Fat Albert cartoon where they're watching the cartoon.
Oh yeah, Brown Hornet. The Brown Hornet.
And they naturally escape. And they naturally escape unharmed. Yes. It's how they resolve every cliffhanger. It's one sentence. Right. They naturally escape unharmed. And every episode of Batman you ever saw on the 1966 show, they get out of whatever the cliffhanger is in one minute. So they can get on to the rest of the show. You don't want to have it happen that fast. You don't want to have it be resolved that fast. But if you construct it right, you can have multiple storylines culminate in the same place at the same time, and have everything come together. So in Enterprise, where we have this sequence where, we've got Pike with his arc, he's in one place. Una, number one, with her arc and her characters, she's someplace else. Spock is in a third place. Connolly is in a fourth place.
Right.
And what do we do in that last section? It's we put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and we pay it off. And depending on how the book is set up, when I wrote the Prey trilogy, I realized there are like 9 payoff scenes in that final sequence. I was actually way over deadline when I was writing it. So I was turning those chapters in every day. It was amazing that it flowed as fast as it did, because I realized, this book has like 8 different ending scenes. And because we have so many characters in this book, but I had moved all the pieces into the proper place. So the dominoes were right there to go bang, 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 bang. Right. When you start writing a book, by no means do you think that is going to happen. In fact, you're in terror. This book that I'm on right now, I know that by the time I get to the end of it, I'll have that feeling of, okay, yeah, here we go. This bit is paying off. This bit is paying off. This bit is paying off. And the suspense will keep rolling through the book like that. But when you're starting a trilogy, that was 1/3 of a million words almost. You don't think that's going to happen. You're very concerned at that
point. Speaking of the Enterprise War, and I don't know, Chris, how much we're going to get into spoiler territory here. So I will try and keep my stuff as spoiler free as possible, unless we're spoiling.
Let's go
high level.
Let's try not to go into too deep of specifics.
So I'll say, John, you were able to do something that I think is probably the envy of, probably a lot of writers in sci-fi that, fans of these very expansive sci-fi, science fiction fandoms and canons, that are around, which is you were able to create 2 new species. Well, actually, I guess several new species, but a faction and a new species. How much leeway did you have? How much leeway did you have in terms of making those, creating those characters and the characteristics and the backstory and everything else? Or was it a collaborative effort between you and some of the guys at CBS and in the writers' room?
Once we had the broad strokes of what would happen to the characters, or what they would go through, what they would be feeling during this book, and we knew that we wanted a sequence where Pike and Spock would be bonding, as we see in sort of that shipwreck section. Right. But when we got to the villains, the combatants in this war that we're in, that's pretty much all mine. Nice. And that was something where I wanted to just tell a pure military science fiction story in the middle of Star Trek. We've got this war that's going on with the Klingons, but a Starfleet war looks a lot different than a lot of the other military sci-fi, sort of engagements that you see.
Right.
And I wanted to come up with an outfit in the Boundless that it has a long tradition. They've got their own jargon, they've got their own rivalries that they have that are going on. They have their own procedures. I wanted us to, firm. That's right. I wanted us to land in the middle of them doing what they normally do, right. And we would sort of realize that this has been going on for a long time, and I wanted to have it feel a bit different than all of the other. There's so many military science fiction stories I've done. I mean, look, I've done armored characters from Iron Man to Mandalorians to I have a book of my own called Overdraft. There's just all kinds of different ways to do armored soldiers. In fact, I just did them in that Battlestar Galactica comic series. So they're not even to mention stormtroopers. But I wanted to do something where the actual outfits that they're in is secondary in interest to how they operate, what they're going around, what they're doing, and how they integrate the people that they grab. I wrote the Mandalorian Wars period of Star Wars in the comic series called Knights of the Old Republic, which is now available in these big 3 giant volumes from Marvel. These epic collections for the Old Republic is what they call it. And in those, I tangle with this problem that I kind of was, given by the video game of how does this nomadic, honor-driven, group of, armored characters take over the galaxy or nearly do so over the course of about 3 years. And I had to come up with all of these mechanisms and war forges and, uniforms, because again, all the Mandalorians before that, they all looked different. And I didn't feel like I really had, the leeway there, given what else had been established, to kind of do it entirely my own way. And here I was able to, this idea of, these waves, these large, sort of division level units that, are operating independently from one another, but, clearly have some sort of, networking between them, and cooperation between them. This is, like all of the armies in the theater in Europe, without the Supreme Headquarters being able to tell them what to do. I thought that was interesting, and I wanted a large part of the book to show them and what they were doing and how the Enterprise people integrate into it, because I wanted the Connolly character in particular, him and Baladon, I wanted them to get the whole experience.
Right.
And I wanted to show how over the course of the basic, this book takes place over the course of a year. That's a lot of time.
Yes.
I wanted to try to, show credibly how somebody like Connolly could kind of end up not being indoctrinated, but he decides, all right, this is my life. I've been drafted by the space alien army. I got a deal. I got to figure out how to do this. I'm not going to escape, because I don't think anybody else survived. From his point of view, he does what he thinks is a logical thing. And a lot of this, whole book is about, we're in this nebula, but the fog of war is everywhere. Nobody knows. Pike doesn't know where Una is. Nobody knows that Spock is even out there until they see him outside one day. And again, that really helps us set it all up in the end. And so it's a unique kind of story, in terms of, having that much time to play with. It allowed it to be multiple personal voyages that would, go, off in other directions and then intersect.
Well, I would also say that, you did a really good job of making the Boundless, so minor spoiler for the Enterprise War. It really kind of sets everything up. Is the Boundless is this faction that comes in and, they're fighting a war, and they basically will raid another ship, any kind of stray ship that they find or people that they find, and conscript them into their army to help fight this war that they're in. And you did a really good job, I think, of, despite the fact that the Boundless is essentially kidnapping these people and forcing them to fight, justifying A, why they were doing it, and B, making them showing a level or creating a level of empathy for why they decided to make the choices that they've made.
And that's always difficult to do. And if we pulled it off, I'm delighted. I have their, the intention was always that, Pike would show up at the end and say, okay, you guys, no. Even if you do the right thing in the end, even if you do the right thing in the end, we're not going to reward you for all that you've done in the past. But even, Connolly is going throughout. He's going, this is not what this is not a good thing for us to be doing. We have that sort of feeling of, I I don't know that the boundless, even Corrigan, I don't know that she necessarily feels remorse at what's going on, but she's just exhausted.
Sure.
I think she's because we've kind of made it plain there that she's from a long-lived species. She's been out there 70, 80 years, however long we had it, and it's been inconclusive battle, one after the next, after the next, after the next. And, again, she has no particular sympathy for the recruits, as we call them, that she's bringing in. But at the same time, she has seen enough to know that she has seen too much, as they say in the baseball movie. She's just had it. And, we kind of balance that against somebody who is wholly amoral or immoral in the case of Baladon, who I love, and I'm glad he's in the book. And I'm really glad that he was voiced by Robert Petkoff.
He did a fantastic
as I suggested, because I said this guy would be played by Max von Sydow. This is somebody, he has a tremendous vocabulary and he's very erudite, but he's also talking about eviscerating people, and it's just joyful for him. And and so he just nails that all throughout. So and he never gets upset, at least that I hear about it, that I'm making him do some of these difficult voices. Although I know he was really tired of doing Krug, because Krug hurts the voice. Yeah. Back when we were doing the Prey trilogy. Because that's really give me Genesis. Oh my gosh, give me Genesis. I mean, that's just a very, very hard voice to do.
Yeah. So while we're talking about kind of the plot, while I was reading Enterprise War, I was really thinking, like, this feels like an episode of Star Trek. Like, I could just see, like, this being like a two-parter or an entire, like, season of Star Trek or something. And you mentioned that you write in a lot of different, like, sort of universes. And so I'm wondering how do you make something feel like Star Trek, or like what are the elements that you include to make something feel like Star Trek, or is that something that you don't do consciously, or how does that work for you?
Well, you kind of know whether it fits or not. I will say I tried to make this like a season because I knew it would take place during the entire span of season one. So I kind of had up in front, this is going to be a story that's going to have different phases. So we have that section up front, which is deliberately, people will say it starts slow. It's supposed to start slow because we have to establish this section where, Pike and everybody are upset about being left out of the war. It's a short section, but we do have it. What we kind of do is we when we're approaching something like this, we say, as the writers, what fits this world in terms of, is it too, if you're doing Star Wars, is there too much science in what you're writing about? Because if there is, you can't do it. Right. We don't get into highly technical explanations for things. Star Wars, when tech speak is spoken, it's gobbledygook. But nobody, tell me the name of an engineer in Star Wars off the top of your head. And it's not easy to do. You have to go off into the expanded universe or into something else. Maybe the people that put together the Death Star. That's you have to go several layers outward to get to something like that. And so with Star Trek, though, you can actually get into questions like, I've got a whole section here asking whether the Enterprise will float. And if it were floating, how would you get it upright? How would you get it off world again? How could you do these things? And, you're talking about, methane. You're talking about, Titan, the moon of Saturn. You're talking about real life things. The the specific strategy that they use to get out of the one situation that they're in is something that, I talked with, a friend of mine, a scientist, brain type friend of mine, who does, we used to kind of have these debates back in high school and college. How would you do this? What would be the physical ramifications? How would this work? And you could put that in Star Trek, because Star Trek, even though we have dilithium and trilithium, and I'm sure somebody's going to invent quadrilithium one day, Star Trek is also a universe where real things have physical properties that at least must obey the laws either of physics or the pseudo-physics that have been created by the Star Trek universe. This is why when I'm doing a book like the very first thing I did, which was the ebook Absent Enemies for the Titan line, which incidentally has a very, very cool Enterprise War connection that people will figure out in retrospect, I think. That's a story where, the whole bit about it is, the episode where Geordi and Ro end up phasing through the decks of the Enterprise. The inspiration for that whole story was, how does that work? How does that function? What would happen if you were in a situation like that? And could you use a situation like that to, for example, let two civilizations coexist in the same space? And what if those civilizations were at war? And it sort of goes from there. You would never use that as a springboard for Star Wars or even something like Galactica, which is built around a much different premise. Galactica is just very simply, for example, Galactica. What it would feel like is what it is, which is it's the final unfilmed season of Baba Black Sheep, Black Sheep Squadron, the airplane show about Pappy Boyington and his misfits. It is no mistake that the script editor for the last season of Black Sheep Squadron goes on to be the script editor for Battlestar Galactica. That's Donald Belisario, who would later on go on to do Quantum Leap. They're pretty much using the same stories between, World War II island hopping, the guys that are friends flying around in airplanes, and crash landing on the island of the week. Well, that's exactly what Galactica is. They're crash landing on the planet of the week, and, just visiting whatever set Universal happens to have available. But that's what one of those stories feels like. And so, if you're going to tell a story like that, there are not a whole lot of Star Wars, we're crash landing and winding up in the middle of a Western, stories, because it just feels different. And again, same with Star Trek. You kind of know when you're in a Star Trek TV show or when you're in a Star Trek movie. There's the things that are important to the characters, the way the characters talk, the things that are important in the characters' lives, they're just different. Star Trek, we almost never care about energy. We never care about power. Star Trek is the basic conceit of Star Trek at the beginning is, what if energy costs nothing to create? We have no economy. We have no anything other than we're going to go exploring. We're going to go expanding knowledge because we're no longer going to be trying to, manufacture and sell Mercedes Benzes to each other because, well, anybody can have one because we'll just replicate it. It's a different feeling. If you live in the universe with the characters, you kind of know what story feels like it's in the universe. And that's something where even as a kid, I knew, there was a comic book, an issue of the original Marvel Star Wars series where they discover a living spaceship. And I was like, even at age 12, I was like, this is a nice story. It doesn't fit. This is a story that probably should have ended up being over in the Star Trek comic.
some of the remarkable things that have happened in, again, monumental things that I think happened in this book. So, we talked about the fact that you were able to create new races. But in addition to creating new races, you gave us our deepest and best glimpse into a character that we've known for 50 years, but haven't really known. And our deepest look into number one, into Una. You've created a backstory for her. You've called her Una more than anyone has ever in the history of Star Trek. So that was remarkable. How, and of course there is a thing that happens during the course of, this book that I won't spoil for other people that is monumental. And it provides a way, it provides a vehicle for us to kind of, split the groups, from each other. But it is monumental nonetheless. How excited were you? Were these things, first off, were these things that you knew ahead of time that you were going to be able to do, spend time with number one and kind of develop her backstory? And the other thing that will go unmentioned, and, how excited were you when you realized that these were things that you were going to be able to do?
I knew that I needed to have, sort of the cast divided, and I knew how I was going to do that. And, that the method, which we won't discuss, was absolutely something that was in just about every version of the plot that I came up with.
Okay.
I wanted to have Una. First of all, I needed to have her called Una because you just can't say number one all the time.
Especially as much as you were talking about her.
Well, and when it's in her own thoughts too. I mean, it just and so fortunately, Una had already been named in the other novels years earlier. And we went with the title, or we went with the name, back in the very first of the Discovery novels. And I was happy to go with it here. And, now I wanted to sort of show that, she had these responsibilities, on the ship, but that also she was kind of the true north for Pike.
Sure.
Because Pike, at least as we see him in the cage, he is wobbling all around, in terms of whether he's going to stay with this outfit or not, how he should feel about it, and then, dealing with the Telosians just upsets it even further. But she is always there to sort of be a different kind of advisor or counselor, if you will. One of the things that we deal with in the book is that Pike is lamenting the fact that he is divided from Una, and divided from also Dr. Boyce,
right?
Who is his sort of, confessor with a cocktail glass, right. They're not in the same physical location, and he's having to make do with both his communications with Spock, who is we established that they were not yet that close. And also, he gets to warm up to a character that I got to create in its entirety, and that is one of my favorite characters in the book, and that's Dr. Galajian, the engineer. And so, Dr. O, that's another character that Robert Petkoff just when he does that voice, he just slays me. He's everything I wanted in the character. But Una is sort of, this part of his support system. But she also exists on her own, and she gets a chance to try to hold, the rest of this cast together, on her own, and then we see what happens when even she is not available to help them. They're all just sort of like, okay, we're in trouble now.
Oh man, well, this time has flown by. We're coming up on the end of the hour that I promised, but before I say our ending salutations, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about this, even though it's not strictly about Star Trek. But you, of course, wrote one of the final Star Wars Legends novels, Kenobi, before that line was rebranded as Legends. And I know you said when conversations about Obi-Wan tend to flare up, it certainly helps feed sales of that book. But beyond that, how do you feel about new Obi-Wan stories in a format for Disney streaming service, especially considering your direct role in creating a very prominent one within the last several years?
Well, more Obi-Wan is always good. I'm excited to see it. I've always said whether it's something that I'm connected to or not, or whether it's something that draws in any way on what I've done or not. I will be in the audience, and I certainly. I think that it is something that people have been asking for a very long time. And as far as anything else connected to it, we'll see what the future holds. As they say, as the little green guy says, always in motion, the future is, and we'll see. I wrote that book. I started writing that book actually in 2006 as a graphic novel, and
Really?
it got longer and longer and longer, and I realized there's no way in the world that this will ever fit in anything short of a prose novel, and it ended up going on the shelf for 6 years, and it did not come back until I was writing novels for Del Rey. And that's when that happened. And it was a major, risk at the time because, it was, yes, it's a Western. It's a Western romance. It takes place over a long period of time. Although it only really has a few incidents in it, that we see him in. It is mostly told through the point of view of other characters. And there are no lightsaber fights and there are no space battles. And it's one of those things where, for people who were looking for a story that had, Obi-Wan Kenobi rushing off to defend Luke Skywalker from a Sith Lord or something like that, or people who are looking for him to go off world and start sneaking around from planet to planet, helping the rebellion, that was not going to be what they were going to get from this book, because that's not how I see the character, or how I see this whole period. I really see him as he is paying the price in his exile for his lack of vision, to use the Emperor's phrase, for not seeing the danger that was out there. He is not the new hope. He is the hope that failed. And he has to try to come to terms with that, while also dealing with the fact that all of his friends are dead. And so that's the book that we wrote. And, it was embraced by the, 95% of fans who, were interested in seeing that or were open to seeing that. And it's still selling today, and I'm delighted about that. As for, where they go with the TV show, who knows? And those who know would not be allowed to say anyway.
Right. Well, one other hypothetical that I wanted to ask you real fast, because one of the other things that we learned coming out of Star Trek Las Vegas was that some books that have been on ice for a while, taking place in the Kelvin timeline, are now finally going to be released. Is that an area of the Star Trek universe that you'd be interested in playing in at all, or are you more interested potentially in hanging your hat in the Prime universe, potentially as more new developments are now finally starting to come out for it?
Everything is always I always have to battle this desire to be able to open up and write about as much stuff as possible, and have the fewest constrictions, and have the most running room, so to speak. I'm always torn between that and also, wanting to have more work by others to be able to draw upon, and to elaborate on, and to connect to. And so, that would be the challenge with doing something in the Kelvin universe. It's one of, there's so much space available. There's so much time available. There's almost an opposite pressure going on, because, you know that you don't want to, anything you do is going to leave an imprint. And you don't want to do anything that's going to make it impossible for them to do something, with a character or something, somewhere else. I mean, some character that has not yet appeared, say in the Kelvin universe.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Very understandable. Well, John, we can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time and talking with us about Enterprise War and some of the other things that you've had going on. And we're really excited that you've got another Star Trek Discovery book coming down the pike. No pun intended. Where can people find you online, and what more do you think people should be taking a look at from you in the near future?
Okay, people can find me at farawaypress.com, where I have notes on many of my previous books, although I have not gotten that. I haven't written any essays about any books more recent than Prey, so or rather more recent than Takedown. So I will eventually get to those. If I can just start, if I can get a month between writing novels, I'll get more of those behind the scenes essays online. And on Twitter, they can find me at JJMFarAway. And also on Facebook, John Jackson Miller. As for what's coming up, there's the aforementioned Star Trek book for 2020. There's the aforementioned Battlestar Galactica graphic novel, which is called Counter-Strike, which is going to be out from Dynamite. One of my Star Wars comics I did for kids. I did the Star Wars annual last year for IDW. That is coming out in a collected edition from IDW, also like October or November this year as well. And the other things that I mentioned are in stores now. I've got, as I say, I've got original graphic novels for Dumbo and Lion King that both came out this summer. And so people can find those in their bookstore or on Amazon or someplace else.
Or in your local comic shop, and check your final order cutoff dates.
And thank you.
Oh, it was our supreme pleasure to have you on, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future when we got more Star Trek stuff to talk about. That would be just a lot of fun. So great. That's going to do it, everybody, for episode number 45 of Discovery Debrief. We hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please like and follow us on our social media channels. If you'd be so kind, we'd also appreciate it if you were to review for the show on iTunes or Facebook, since it only takes a minute, and we'll be happy to read your review on the air when it is posted. If you have any questions, you can follow the show on Twitter at DSC Debrief, where you can also find all of our individual Twitter handles. And feel free to send us questions through Twitter, our Facebook like page, or by emailing us at hailingfrequencies@discoverydebrief.com. Please be sure to set your courses for this feed for future episodes, and be sure to join us as we convene next time to discuss the increasingly bright future of those bold adventures into the final frontier. As always, though, until we meet again, please go boldly, my friends.